Reed Ashworth had coached 7 seasons of youth flag football in Cedarville, North Carolina, and in all that time, no player had ever shown up to his door at 9 o'clock on a school night, alone, in pajama pants and untied sneakers, holding a backpack like it contained everything he owned. "Please," Eli Vance said, when Reed opened the door. "They took my dad." 4 words, and Reed felt every ordinary plan he'd had for that evening evaporate at once. He didn't yet know that they meant a private psychiatric facility 40 minutes outside town, that took meant something closer to the truth than he wanted to believe. Or that the next 9 days would end with 67 motorcycles parked outside a locked facility gate, and a business manager who had built a profitable career out of exactly how long the system allows a person to disappear before anyone starts asking uncomfortable questions. Cedarville sat in the rolling country an hour east of Asheville, a town small enough that the Youth Football League practiced on the same field the high school team used on Friday nights, and Reed Ashworth had lived there his whole life. The town's one hospital had closed its inpatient wing a decade back, which meant anyone in Cedarville needing serious medical or psychiatric care got routed to whatever facility in the region had a bed and a contract with the county. A detail nobody thought much about until it mattered. Reed was 45 years old, worked as a paralegal at the county's legal aid clinic, and had been a member of the Iron Vow Motorcycle Club for 16 years, ever since a chapter brother helped him through the ugliest custody fight of his own life. He coached flag football on Tuesday evenings because his own son had aged out of the league 5 years ago, and Reed had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he missed it more than he'd expected to. Marcus Vance had signed Eli up for the league the year before, one of the quieter fathers on the sideline, the kind who showed up early to help set out cones and never needed thanking for it. Reed had liked him immediately, a single father raising a 7-year-old alone since his wife Denise died in a highway accident 2 years back, working long shifts at the lumber yard, still finding the energy most weeks to toss a football in the front yard until the streetlights came on. Reed crouched down to Eli's height on the porch, the way he'd learned to talk to scared kids over 3 decades of coaching. "Show me what happened," he said. 4 words, gentle, unhurried. Eli's answer came out in fragments, the halting speech of a child repeating something he didn't fully understand himself. Men in uniforms, an ambulance without lights or sirens, his dad saying, "It's okay, buddy. I'll be back tonight 3 days ago," and not coming back since. "He promised," Eli whispered, the word catching on itself the way a promise does when a child has started to suspect it might not hold. A neighbor had been watching Eli in the meantime, distracted and overwhelmed with 3 kids of her own, and Eli had slipped out the back door that evening after calling the number on his dad's old work badge and reaching a disconnected line. Before we get any further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what Reed found over the following 9 days wasn't a simple misunderstanding at a hospital front desk. It was a pattern, built carefully and profitably, of holding people exactly as long as an insurance policy would pay for it. Now, back to 3 days earlier, and the ordinary Tuesday that became the worst day of Marcus Vance's life. Marcus Vance was 34 years old, and had spent the 2 years since Denise's death doing the quiet, unglamorous work of holding a small family together on a lumber yard salary, and a grief he rarely let himself examine in daylight. He kept her photograph on the dashboard of his truck, still wore his wedding ring, and had gotten into the habit of talking to her out loud sometimes while he worked in the garage, the way people do when the person they miss most was also the person who used to hear about their day. He packed Eli's lunch every morning with a note tucked inside, a habit Denise had started, and Marcus had never once let lapse. Even on mornings he could barely remember driving to work afterward. That Tuesday, a forklift accident at the lumber yard injured a coworker Marcus considered a friend. and standing in the parking lot afterward, watching the ambulance pull away. Something in him that had been held together with 2 years of careful effort came apart all at once. He sat down on the curb and cried, hard. The kind of crying a grown man rarely lets anyone see, and a well-meaning coworker, alarmed and unsure what else to do, called 911 for a wellness check. The responding officers found a man in visible distress, and rather than the 10-minute conversation and a ride home that might have ended things there, a private transport contractor arrived instead. One that Cedarville's police department, like many small departments without their own crisis response unit, had a standing contract with. Marcus was placed on a 72-hour psychiatric hold at Meadowbrook Behavioral Health, a private facility 40 minutes outside town, on the strength of a single stressful afternoon that any reasonable person might have recognized as grief, not danger. The 72 hours became 6 days, and then 9, extended each time by paperwork signed not by the treating physician, who had quietly noted in Marcus's chart that he no longer met criteria for an involuntary hold, but by Gary Sumner, Meadowbrook's business operations manager, a man with no medical license and considerably more say over release timelines than any single doctor on staff. Gary Sumner was 51 years old and had built his entire career on a number most people never think to ask about: the average billable length of stay per patient, and how thoroughly a facility's own paperwork could be used to extend it. He had come up through hospital administration rather than medicine, moving between 3 different behavioral health chains over 2 decades, always landing in operations roles that measured success in occupancy rates rather than outcomes. He had learned, over 11 years running Meadowbrook's business office, exactly which patients were least likely to have a lawyer, a loud family member, or the kind of insurance plan that triggered outside review. And Marcus Vance, a widower with no immediate family checking in and a solid employer-sponsored plan that covered inpatient psychiatric care generously, fit the profile precisely. Marcus asked every day to call his son. He was told the phones were down, or that calls weren't permitted until his treatment team cleared it, or that agitation about leaving too soon was itself a symptom worth documenting. The unit fell into a particular silence each evening once visiting hours ended. A quiet Marcus had started to dread more than anything else about the place, because it meant another full day had passed without a single word reaching his son. He was not violent. He was not confused. He was, increasingly, a man watching a system built to help people quietly decide it was more profitable to keep him. Reed started with a phone call to Meadowbrook the morning after Eli showed up at his door, expecting the kind of ordinary bureaucratic runaround any parent might hit trying to check on a relative. What he got instead was a front desk that wouldn't confirm Marcus was even a patient there without a court order. A patient advocate line that rang through to voicemail 3 times in a row, and a hospital records department that cited privacy law to avoid answering a question as simple as when can his son visit. Each call ended the same way: a polite refusal wrapped in enough procedure to sound reasonable. And by the second day, Reed had started keeping a written log of every conversation, dated and timed. The habit of a man who had learned the hard way that memory alone rarely holds up in front of a judge. By the 3rd day, Reed had done what his years as a paralegal had trained him to do when a system stopped making sense. He started pulling records. A public database of state health inspections turned up 2 prior citations against Meadowbrook for extended holds without adequate physician documentation. Both resolved with fines the facility's parent company had paid without ever admitting fault. A legal aid colleague in the next county over mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd handled 3 similar cases against the same facility in the last 18 months. Patients held past their release-ready date. Families locked out of contact. Holds mysteriously extended each time an insurance authorization was due for renewal. This isn't a mistake. Reed told Eli's neighbor on the fourth day, the two of them now coordinating who watched Eli while the other made calls. This is a business model. He filed an emergency writ of habeas corpus that afternoon, the legal mechanism that exists precisely for a person being held without adequate cause, and got a hearing scheduled for the following Monday, 4 days out. The clerk who processed the filing, a woman who had seen 100 routine custody disputes cross her desk, but rarely anything framed this way, told Reed privately that she'd flag it for the judge's morning docket rather than let it sit in the usual queue. 4 days was still too long for a 7-year-old sleeping in a neighbor's spare room and asking every morning whether today was the day his dad came home. Reed drove out to Meadowbrook himself on the 5th day, writ paperwork in hand, and found Gary Sumner in the lobby, unbothered by a courtroom filing he'd clearly seen plenty of before. "I'd like to see Marcus Vance," Reed said. 5 words. "Family visits require treatment team approval," Sumner said, pleasant in the specific way of a man who'd said that sentence 100 times to 100 different people. "I'm not able to override clinical judgment." His treating physician noted 3 days ago that he no longer meets hold criteria. Reed held up the chart excerpt his legal aid colleague had helped him obtain through the county's oversight board. "You overrode that yourself. In writing." Sumner's easy expression held for exactly 1 more second. Facility policy allows administrative review of discharge timing. Facility policy doesn't override state law. Reed's voice didn't rise. He never had to. "I have a hearing Monday. I'd rather not need it." "That's not up to me," Sumner said, and reached for his phone instead of an answer. "I'll need you to leave the premises." "Go ahead and call security," Reed said. "While you're waiting, you should know something else." "What's that?" "Check the parking lot." Outside, a sound had begun gathering that most people passing on the state route mistook, at first, for weather rolling down out of the mountains, except it kept building instead of passing over. It gathered from both directions of the 2-lane road at once, steady, deliberate, the sound of something that had been organized rather than something that had happened by chance. "What is that?" Sumner asked, his confidence, for the first time, showing a crack. Reed didn't answer. He didn't need to. Engines, first, and then chrome catching the afternoon light along the length of Meadowbrook's frontage road. 67 motorcycles rolling into the facility's visitor lot, and the shoulder beyond it, in a slow, disciplined column, filling every open space within view of the lobby windows. Engines dying in sequence until the lot held nothing but the tick of 67 cooling engines and a silence heavy enough that the receptionist behind Sumner's shoulder stopped typing entirely. The silence stretched long enough that a nurse 2 floors up, drawn to the window by the sudden quiet where engine noise had been building moments before, would later tell a coworker it was the stillest she'd ever seen that parking lot in 9 years working there. A local news van, tipped off by Reed's legal aid colleague that morning, pulled in 8 minutes later and began setting up a camera at the edge of the lot. Not one rider approached the building. Not one voice was raised. They only stood, a wall of quiet witnesses in a parking lot that had never in Meadowbrook's history held anything but ordinary sedans and the occasional ambulance. And the sheer visibility of it did something no phone call had managed in 5 days. It made Gary Sumner's private business practices suddenly, uncomfortably public. A woman stepped forward from the riders near the entrance, the chapter's road captain, silver-haired, a patch reading families first stitched over her chest, a program the Iron Vow ran for exactly situations like this one. She stood beside Reed without a word, and behind her, 3 other people Reed recognized from his legal aid colleague's case files stepped forward too, family members of Meadowbrook's prior patients, each holding a folder of their own. Missed Sumner, one of them said. An older man whose own brother had spent 11 extra days here 2 years earlier. We compared our discharge dates last night. Every single one of them lines up with an insurance authorization renewal. Sumner did the math the way people in his position eventually always did, once the math stopped favoring him. A habeas corpus hearing 4 days out. A parking lot full of witnesses and a camera crew already rolling. 3 former patients' families ready to testify to a pattern that would take considerably longer to explain away than it had taken to build. He made a call to Meadowbrook's corporate counsel that nobody in that lobby needed to overhear to understand had gone badly, and 20 minutes later, a nurse walked Marcus Vance out through the front doors himself. Discharge paperwork signed 5 days later than any doctor's actual judgment had called for. Marcus blinked in the daylight like a man who hadn't seen enough of it lately, and found his son standing at the edge of a parking lot filled with more motorcycles than Eli had ever seen in one place, waiting for him. Eli ran the last 20 feet without waiting for permission, and Marcus dropped to his knees on the asphalt to catch him. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered into his son's hair, over and over, though nothing that had happened over the last 9 days had been his fault to apologize for. He didn't deserve to explain his tears to anyone. He didn't have to. The state health department opened a formal investigation into Meadowbrook's discharge practices within the week, spurred along by news coverage that ran the following morning under a headline neither Reed nor Marcus had wanted to be the center of, but were grateful, in the end, had run anyway. 3 other families received corrected records and formal apologies, and 2 more came forward in the weeks that followed, encouraged by the coverage to finally ask the questions they'd been too intimidated to ask alone. Gary Sumner was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome, the first real consequence in 11 years, for a business model that had quietly profited off exactly how long a frightened person can be made to wait. Marcus took 2 weeks off from the lumber yard once the investigation began, spending most of it in his own front yard throwing a football with Eli until the streetlights came on. The way he had most evenings before a Tuesday afternoon had nearly cost him 9 days he'd never get back. He started seeing an actual therapist not long after. A real one, chosen carefully, on his own terms, from a referral Reed's legal aid clinic kept for exactly this reason. Because grief, he told Reed one evening on the sideline, had turned out to be something worth tending properly, rather than something to be ashamed a stranger had once seen him carrying. He went back to coaching alongside Reed the following season, and made a point, every practice, of being the first parent to arrive. Eli still keeps his father's old work badge in his backpack, the one with the disconnected number he dialed that first frightened night, not because he needs it for anything now, but because some objects earn keeping only by being present for the day everything went wrong, and the day it finally went right again. If this story reached you, if you believe that a system built to help people should never be allowed to profit from holding them instead, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that a 7-year-old's plea for help can still move a parking lot full of strangers to show up and refuse to leave. Subscribe to Iron Vow Stories so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, how far would you go for a kid who showed up at your door saying 4 words like Eli's?